Hello, how are you all? Hola. Special welcome to this discussion series that we have launched at the Jindal School of International Affairs relating to the coronavirus pandemic, the fallout, the aftermath, the broader implications of this for politics, economics, foreign policy, and all other related elements. So we are in the midst of a planetary crisis that seems to be getting worse, especially impacting the developing world more than before. If you, the audience will recall, first it began in China, then spread to North America and Europe, and now the focus increasingly shifting to the Latin American region. And this region, for all of your information, is not a small one in terms of size. We have more than 650 million people in Latin America, which is South America, Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean. So this is almost 10% of humanity. And we are now witnessing a serious uptick in cases in some countries. And there's a lot of anxiety and worry that Latin America may follow the disasters that we've already seen in the US and in Europe. So what are the strengths and weaknesses of Latin America? How can the region cope with this catastrophic scenario that's unfolding, and where did some of these countries go wrong? What could be done to now do course correction? What are the broader repercussions of this public health pandemic for the region? So these are some of the topics we're going to discuss today, and I have a very, very distinguished friend and senior scholar, diplomat, and intellectual from Chile, Ambassador Jorge Heine. So Jorge is going to take us through all these parameters that I've laid out. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much. He is now at the Pardee School at Boston University in the US, but has held so many distinguished positions, including cabinet minister in his native Chile and ambassador to the most important countries in the developing world, including India and China and South Africa. So he's a scholar, diplomat, and also a lawyer. So really, we are so honored to have you on the show, Jorge.
Thank you, Sreeram. We are privileged to participate in this series. Let me start with a broader theoretical concern, if we to take sort of a big picture approach to this issue, and this is the following. It seems to me it's important to keep in mind that in international relations, in the realist school, a main concern is what should governments do? And what it is said, what we find in the literature is that what should guide the government's action is the national interest, to husband, to take care of the national interest. Now, there's a big debate as to what that exactly means, but at the core, it means worrying and taking care of and protecting the territory and the population of the country, the nation. So, in that sense, it seems to me, it is very important to keep in mind that that is the primary job of government. If governments fail to protect the nation, if governments fail to protect the nation from harm that comes from abroad or elsewhere, they are in trouble, they are not fulfilling the duty. And what we have here is an extraordinary situation, because the old view that challenges to the nation state would come from armies, would come from air forces, would come from navy, the sort of the 19th century view, has of course been displaced by these new global challenges that we face. And what we have is something that is very different from the traditional challenges to the nation state. And this is a virus that comes from abroad. You can't see it, but it causes as much, if not more harm, than the attack of an army, the attack of an air force, the attack of a navy. And what I would like to posit to you is that basically many governments around the world have failed to realize this. They have been preparing for the challenges of the 19th century. They have not been preparing for the challenges of the 21st century. And I remind you, some people say nobody could have foreseen this. This was totally a big surprise. That is false. If there is something that has been foreseen, if there's something that has been forecast, it has been this. Bill Gates at the Munich conference in 2017, at the Munich Security Conference, which I'm sure you know about, he said there are three global challenges facing humanity. One is climate change, the second one is nuclear war, and the third is pandemics. President Obama in 2015 said, we are going to have a pandemic and we're going to have it perhaps in 2019. I mean, you can't be more precise than that. And yet, basically, the world was caught unawares and wasn't prepared to face this. So I think that is very important to keep in mind, because we can't go on like this, and the next big challenge that we're going to face after this is going to be, of course, climate change, perhaps within 10 years, perhaps less. And what cannot happen is that once again, governments are caught unawares with their pants down and not knowing what to do. I see this as a bit of a trial run for, as the economists put it, the fire next time, which is going to be also a big global problem.
Very true, very true. In fact, that lays out the canvas for the discussion. I think the priorities, like you said, and the threat perceptions and the traditional notion of national security, all these have been thrown aside, because this is of a different nature altogether. And clearly, many governments, many countries around the world did not prepare for this, or did not essentially prioritize public health and such things. And we are seeing now the devastating impact of that. So yes, it is actually a kind of judgment on the very flawed basis on which the world order had been built.
That's right. And you get to some of the basic notions on which we have built our public policy, that the key thing is efficiency and cost cutting and austerity. Well, now we find that this cost cutting and this austerity has led governments to get rid of inventories of masks, of vaccines, of medicines, of personal protective equipment. And so governments are scrambling around the world because they didn't have inventories, they didn't have it in storage. They said, well, we can always buy it, let's get rid of this. And that sort of short-term mentality, it seems to me, needs to be replaced by a mentality that looks at survival and the needs of the people and protecting the people, rather than this mindless cost cutting that has been at the heart of the neoliberal approach.
Yeah. So the purpose of government, it seems, which is such a fundamental thing, is up in the air now, because the purpose of government, it's what it was meant to be, and what it's, to whom it is accountable. These big questions are coming up. So in that context, let me begin by asking you, Jorge, I mean, if you look at the statistics and the human tragedies unfolding in your region, in Latin America, now Brazil, I want to take up, the big countries, the most populous countries. Brazil is 205 million people. It's almost 1/3 of the region's population is in one country. And we have there a colossal leadership failure of Jair Bolsonaro, and there has been an anarchy almost, or chaos. The federal government is at odds with the states and the governors. The president is openly been flouting the social distancing and encouraging people to to break out of what he considers to be restrictions on their freedoms. So he's had an agenda which has really shocked the world. And of course, we knew Bolsonaro before the crisis, but I think there is something very unique about this far-right populism. We have also seen even in the US also. I would like you, Jorge, to please explain for the interest of the audiences why Bolsonaro took this approach and why he's so callous about the loss of life. Because Brazil right now, as we talk, in June already they have nearly 40,000 deaths, and it is mounting, and it's accounting for the Latin American region as a whole. As of this time is 70,000.
50,000. Yes.
What went wrong?
That's right. Let me tell you. What happens here, it seems to me, and there's a broader issue. It's not just the case of Brazil. There are obviously other cases as well. And this has to do with, and going back to what I said earlier, what we have is certain outlook on government on government, on governing, from a populist perspective, which is strongly based on denialism, instead of accepting the reality of globalization, instead of accepting the reality of these global challenges, and that we live in an interconnected, interdependent world. They pretend that we do not. And that, for example, simply by closing borders, you will be able to shield yourself from these threats, from these dangers. Obviously, that is not the case. And the extreme case of denialism, of course, is Mr. Bolsonaro, of course, who is in denial of climate change as well. We are seeing how the Amazon forest is being burned down. I am told by my Brazilian friends that many Aboriginal peoples in the Amazon are being decimated by the virus, that many of them may become extinct as a result of this. So what we have is a situation that is so important to understand. It is not that Brazil does not have a very good public health system. It does. In the past, Brazil, for example, in the 90s, dealt very effectively with the AIDS challenge, with the AIDS pandemic, and developed very original tools, also working with India in matters of developing all sorts of medical treatments for AIDS. And so it's not like Brazil, it's not a country that didn't have the conditions to deal with it.
Yeah.
It has very good doctors, very good hospitals, very good scientists. It is just that the government leadership made a terrible error of judgment and led to the current situation. And here we get into, it's a fascinating situation, because basically the federal government has thrown in the towel. As you know, Mr. Bolsonaro is now into his third health minister in as many months. And it's basically the states, Brazil is a federation. It is the governors of the states that are dealing with the pandemic, which is, wreaking havoc throughout the country. But I think it's important to keep in mind that this is the result of a certain political ideology, this, right-wing populism that is in denial about what is actually happening in the world. You see something similar as well in the United Kingdom with Boris Johnson. The United Kingdom was ranked as having the second best health preparedness index in the world only last year. And nowadays it has, I think it's 40,000 deaths out of the pandemic. Mr. Johnson himself, of course, ended up in hospital. Also the result of this denial, of leaders about what is actually happening in the world.
Yeah, so ideology, so definitely the ideologically misplaced, priorities and misguided notions have the people of Brazil are paying a very heavy price. But Jorge, on this question of the populists, I mean, even there is also a so-called leftist populist in Mexico, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, and he also initially did not take the precautionary steps and the measures, although it was not so bad like Bolsonaro, not so blatant. And of course, AMLO, as he's called, I am actually been a fan of AMLO and his progressive agenda, but he also seems to have misplayed his hand to some extent. People are saying that, more than 15,000 deaths in Mexico, but it probably is much worse. And as a proportion of population, it's 120 million people. Mexico is the second biggest country in the region. So, and both of them, in a way, Bolsonaro and AMLO and Lopez Obrador have been saying that, people will die out of hunger, so we should not close anything. There should be no lockdown. The economy comes first. They keep saying the economy comes first. And health doesn't matter, the economy comes first. So they have created this lives versus livelihoods kind of a trade-off. And that has been their selling point. So, I mean, how do they justify this, and what is the politics? Why do they keep on saying we must keep the economy open, we must reopen, it doesn't matter, this is just a common flu, and the economy. But actually it seems the deeper they get into the health crisis, the economy is getting worse. So is this a false dichotomy they have created between economy and health?
Absolutely. No, in the case of, I agree with you, the case of Mexico is different, obviously, from the case of Brazil. But it also showed this tremendous reluctance in acting earlier. You know what they say, when you find yourself with an illness, it's important to take the harsh medicine and take it early. And that is exactly what Mr. Lopez Obrador refused to do. He kept kicking the can down the road until it was too late. And what we see a pattern here in Latin America, there's one exception, we'll talk about that in a moment, but basically the pattern is the following. Those governments that acted early and took the bitter medicine at the beginning have managed to do quite well. Even smaller countries like Paraguay, like Uruguay, like Costa Rica, like Cuba, have managed to keep the death rate at very low rates. Why? Because they closed everything very early and took all the precautionary measures. Whereas others who refuse to do that, like Brazil, like Mexico, they are paying a very heavy price. And then there are those in between that established sort of partial quarantines that didn't work very well either. And among those is the case of Chile, my own country. Chile started relatively well in the sense that there were few deaths, although the number of infections was very high. I was very worried. I saw this great discrepancy between the very high number of infections and the low number of deaths. And I told myself, there's something amiss here. And of course, the death rate, as you know, is a lagging indicator. It only comes 2-3 weeks later. And nowadays in Chile, we are at 2,400 deaths. I think it's the third or fourth highest in Latin America. And the situation is really bad. And the interesting cases here we can sort of compare and contrast. One country that is also very tragic is the case of Peru, because Peru did all the needful. It started very, very early, closed down, established a quarantine. But what happens is that Peru is a country in which the informal sector is very big. The average, informal sector in terms of percentage of the labor force in Latin America is around 50%. So half of the working force works informally. As you know, in India, of course, the informality is also very high. In Peru, this is 70%. What does this mean? That these people either go out to the street and work or they don't have an income. Therefore, it was very difficult to keep these people locked up. Also, something else that happens, and this obviously is not just the case in Peru, but it is particularly so in Peru, is that people live in very crowded conditions. Therefore, keeping social distance, having access to water to wash their hands is something that is extremely limited. Of course, in India, you have similar situation. And therefore, the results have been disastrous. And Peru has also, right now, one of the highest numbers of deaths in around 6,000 deaths today, which is, of course, a very high number. The point, Sreeram, it seems to me that it's important to keep in mind, and this is why it's important for political scientists like you to take a very close look at this. What I say is the virus is the same. What varies is the public policies that are enacted in the various countries to deal with it. So that's why countries like New Zealand, countries like Finland, countries like Taiwan have managed to be so successful because they did the right thing at the right moment. So it's from a comparative perspective. It's really, we have 200 countries. The virus is the same. Why are the outcomes so different? The outcomes are so different because the policies that were undertaken to deal with this global invisible challenge were also very different. And here's another point that is a broader point. It does not relate to Latin America because right now we used to, but we no longer, we don't have any women leaders right now. We used to have in the past, Dilma Rousseff, Michelle Bachelet, Cristina Fernandez, but not right now. But there's an interesting pattern. This is nothing new. I'm sure you have seen it elsewhere, but I've been impressed by what female leaders have done around the world. It's a different type of leadership. What Angela Merkel has done in Germany, what Jacinda Ardern has done in New Zealand, what Tsai Ing-wen has done in Taiwan, what Sena Marin has done in Finland. And these are not leaders that give rousing speeches that are very grandiloquent, they go into the weeds. They worry about details. You know, Angela Merkel, as you know, is a physicist and natural scientist, and they solve problems. And this, it seems to me, the sort of leadership that we need in today's world. Leaders actually protect their followers, they protect their citizens, instead of giving rousing speeches that don't mean much. You know, if you get ill and die because the government hasn't taken the appropriate measures to protect you.
Very true. In fact, we need less machismo and more care.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And I also take your point, Jorge, about the timing and the quality of and the good governance. You know, it seems that those matter a lot in explaining the differential outcomes with the handling the virus and the response to the virus. Now, talking of that, you know, the governance in Latin America has been under question even before Corona. And you know, last year, 2019, the media called it the Latin American Spring. There were mass protests and you know, social unrest on the streets relating to inequality and corruption and poor public services and subsidies and these kind of things. So and according to the UN ECLAC, for which where you were a you know research fellow also, the average growth in the region, Latin America, before coronavirus for the last 7 years was just 0.5%. So there is already a backlog of problems, and starting with the commodities, you know, bubble bursting and the sudden fall in the prices of a lot of the minerals that the Latin countries often export for their growth. And then compounded by the social protests, it seems like the region was also socio-economically, not just in terms of governance and leadership, socio-economically also very volatile lately, and is not been stable. We know the crisis in Venezuela is very, very deep. And so, take us through the region, please, in terms of preparedness, not only from in terms of the priorities or the ideology of the leaders, but in terms of the societies. And are they actually already battered so much that they cannot cope with this new depression now? You know, it's a really like a double whammy.
Absolutely. No, 2019 was really very bad. You had these outbursts of, you know, social unrest, starting in Chile. Chile is normally seen as a rather one of the most stable. It's, you know, certainly the most developed country in Latin America, and we are not a country in which we normally see riots and we see big outbursts. We have a different tradition, a very democratic stability tradition. But what happens, Sreeram, is that inequality in Latin America in general, and in Chile in particular, has really gotten out of hand. And people got sick and tired of this. So we had these social unrest, not just in Chile. We also had them in Bolivia, we had them in Ecuador, we had them in Colombia. Why? Because you look at the Gini index and you know, inequality, income inequality, and the income inequality in Latin America is the worst. It's worse than in Africa, worse than in Asia, which a lot of people do not think is the case, but it is the case. And that creates a very serious problem, because, you know, people are sick and tired of being told, well, we must wait for the next wave of reforms. We have had, you know, 3 waves, or people say, wait for the 4th generation of reforms, and then things will be just fine. And they never get to be that. And therefore, governments have been unable to cope with that. And a couple of things, you mentioned the commodity boom. Yes, Latin America did quite well from 2003 to 2013, which was the super commodity cycle, you know, when the price of oil, of copper, of iron ore, of soybeans went up, among other things, because of the demand from China and from India. You know, I was in India from 2003 to 2007 when we met in a visit your school, and the effect of that was that Latin America moved forward, it grew, poverty went down, inequality went down. But what didn't happen was that there was not an effort to industrialize. There was not an effort to draw on those rents, draw on those resources, and do something to add more value to the commodities that are being exported. And as a result of that, when the price of copper, when the price of oil, when the price of iron goes down, well, we go back to the traditional Latin American boom and bust cycle, which has been around with us for 200 years, ever since Latin America became independent. You would think that governments would learn from this. If something happens for 200 years in a row, you would think there would be some learning, but there isn't. It's always the same story. When the prices go up, it's like it's a never-ending party. Taxes are cut and people have a great time. When the prices of commodities go down, then we are in trouble. We don't know what to do. We have to go to the IMF. Instead of saving for a rainy day, which only very few countries do, and investing those rents into productive factories and industries that may get us away from this dependence on commodities. So that, it seems to me, is the big challenge we have. I'm sure you have heard of something called the middle income trap.
Yes.
And that is exactly what Latin America finds itself in. We are caught in this middle income trap. We are unable to get beyond that. We are unable to add more value to our exports and do what, say, the countries in Southeast Asia have managed to do so well, which is to add value to the commodity that they have, and therefore break out of this middle income trap.
Mm. No, so in fact, that takes me to the point about the economic fallout of the corona, tragedy. It seems the UN is predicting that there is going to be a minus 5.2% GDP contraction in the LAC region this year, and 12% unemployment nearly across the region, and huge losses to export-oriented economies of the South American region, which are dependent on China, because China itself is going through a severe economic contraction. And also for Mexico and for Central America, the complete breakdown in the US and the depression in the US is going to impact them. So it seems like the global scenario is not at all conducive for any kind of a quick recovery or rebound now for Latin America, which means that these economic tensions we spoke about earlier, the unresolved contradictions and the inequalities and the problems, they're probably going to be compounded more, right? So what are we looking at? I mean, going forward now, if this is going to be the scenario for the region, are we going to see more Venezuelas and more, collapses and revolts and possibly military coups? I mean, the talk in Brazil has increasingly been, it's going out of hand, and the military should come in and take charge again. I mean, Bolsonaro is in a way encouraging these trends. So it looks like a very fragile moment going forward for Latin America.
Absolutely. And let me elaborate a bit more on what you just said. It is, in my sense, is that the UN ECLAC's prediction of minus 5.2 growth is really on the short side. Goldman Sachs says it might be -7 or -8. So this is serious stuff. Now, let me tell you, if you take 4 or 5 factors, and they are having a devastating effect. Number one, you have the drop in commodity prices, of which we already talked about. Second, what you have is capital flight. In the past few months, it is estimated somewhere around $16 billion have left Brazil only, let alone many other countries in the region. A third factor, which is often not looked at, is remittances. Latin America receives around 100, much like India, although at a lesser magnitude. Latin America receives around $100 billion a year. That's what it got in 2019 in remittances, mostly from the US, but also from elsewhere. In April, those went down by 20%. So here you're talking right off the bat at, if that's all for a year, $20 billion less. And then you have tourism. Many countries in the region, like Mexico, like Costa Rica, like the countries in the Caribbean, about which we haven't talked, countries like Cuba, Dominican Republic, countries in the English-speaking Caribbean, Jamaica, they depend very heavily on tourism. Tourism, of course, is down to 10% of what it was last year, if at all. And then you have the overall drop in trade. According to the WTO, this year we might see a drop of around a third in global trade. So for countries that are very export-oriented, this, of course, is a major blow. Now, that said, what is the way forward, which is what you really want to get at? It seems to me that a key point here to keep in mind is that either we hang together or we will hang separately. Latin American regionalism, Latin American regional organizations are undergoing a major crisis. The region has never been as fragmented as it is now. You know, the various entities that existed in the past, like UNASUR, like Mercosur, like CELAC, undergoing major crisis, you know, and so there has been very little coordination. And that, of course, cannot be. I mean, my argument in favor of Latin American regionalism has always been that, you know, we are mostly small countries. I mean, Mexico and Brazil are big, Argentina, but many of these countries, we're talking about 30-some countries, you know, most of them quite small, which find it very difficult to face what is happening in the world, to deal with global challenges, unless we get together and are able to come up with some coordinated response. So unless we do that, and this current virus has exposed quite dramatically this situation. So it seems to me it is important that we work together. And let me tell you something else. Another challenge that is coming up, and this is something I've been reflecting about quite a bit, is we are basically at the beginning of the second Cold War, you know, between China and the United States. And Latin America is caught between a rock and a hard place, you know, because traditionally the region has had very good relations with the United States, but China today has a very strong economic presence in Latin America. You know, what to do in this situation? The effects of the first Cold War in Latin America were disastrous. You look at Guatemala, Dominican Republic, Chile, Grenada, things that in many ways still linger. In Guatemala today, the effects of the 1954 intervention still linger, you know. So these are big issues, but we need the sort of leadership that will take up these big issues and that will also be able to deal with the detail-oriented leadership that we talked earlier about, and that female leadership in the world has been able to deal with.
Yeah, so taking up the issue of regionalism, Jorge, I mean, you're right. It seems, I mean, there was an announcement of some $16 million joint fund of Mercosur to share information and to create a regional response to COVID-19. But frankly, it looks like a drop in the ocean. And I think the orientation of Brazil has been a huge disappointment, right? Because earlier in the administration of Lula da Silva, they actually, you know, they had this notion along with Argentina of creating a Buenos Aires consensus, you know, alternative to Washington consensus, and to bring the region together and to improve the coordination mechanisms, including on public health. But now all that seems to have fallen apart, and there is no regional leadership, right? I mean, my book, Trump, which you had endorsed kindly, I remember I had made a point that, you know, under the current leadership of Brazil, we are not going to really be able to achieve any kind of regional integration, because his orientation is towards the US, and he's not getting much from the US either, because Trump doesn't give anyone anything for free. So we have a situation where you know, the mechanisms in the OAS system, I think I find it ironic, and you will agree with me that, you know, Cuba has been so successful always with pandemics and public health, but they continue to keep Cuba out, and, you know, it's not giving confidence, right? I mean, to the region. And so I think that deficit, unlike in Africa, which in fact I was reading, Jorge, Ivan Duque, the president of Colombia, was saying that we need something like the US Centers for Disease Control. And, you know, the Africa has now created a continental centers for disease control that combines the all the 54 member countries of the African Union.
We
That
need something like
agree.
that in Latin America. Of course, absolutely, absolutely. You know, and it seems to me here, Sreeram, one thing that it's important that we keep in mind, and here it seems to me, Latin America can take a page from India. The way forward, I mean, there are many challenges here, economic challenges, social challenges, political challenges. But in terms of international relations, which is the discipline you and I find ourselves in, what we will need in years to come for Latin America is what we and some colleagues have called an active non-alignment, in the sense of placing the region at, you know, an equidistance from both the United States and from China, and being able to build our own position, one that looks after our own interests, you know, much in the tradition of the non-aligned movement, the sort of a third way that was originally proposed by Prime Minister Nehru, and which, you know, has had its ups and downs, and people have different views about the current situation of the non-aligned movement. Obviously, this is something that would need to be updated. It's something that would need to be brought to the 21st century with all that it means. But it seems to me that we have to look at the global South and how we can work together. You know, Latin America with Africa, with Asia. It used to be there were no resources. Nobody had any money. Well, that is not the case. You know, nowadays, with, you know, there's two so-called Asian giants, China and India, that have done so well and that have become real powerhouses. You know, projections indicate that by, you know, 2050, both China and India will be among the top 2-3 economies in the world. So that, it seems to me, is the way forward in what we have to look at, because that is where the action is.
So yes, so regionalism as the first building block within Latin America, but then also inter-regionalism across the broader global South. In fact, the markets, I mean, like we just discussed, if the US is in depression, if China is in depression and they're fighting with each other over trade and over the virus and over, you know, the whole, you know, the blame game and all these things, the options, what are the options for us in the South to wean ourselves away from dependence on these markets and look for self-reliance or a kind of a new kind of a, you know, broader grouping, whether we want to call it non-alignment or something else. I think this is the moment, because South-South cooperation had been growing steadily. We had the BRICS, for example, that involved countries across the various developing world. But now I think we need to think of something broader, and maybe it's time for maybe a smaller power group, you know, to start with, because already the G77, we have 120 countries in it. It's like a big, you know, alphabet soup of all kinds of things. But now maybe a smaller grouping of 10, 15, you know, because we cannot keep on depending on these major powers really for our recovery, it seems to me, because neither China nor the US can really become the engines of growth anytime future after coronavirus. So we need to rethink that. And moving on, Jorge, now the question of ordinary people in Latin America, you know, I want to bring that back for the audience. You know, like you said, this is a human catastrophe, and we need to rethink as international relations scholars beyond the nation state now, and, you know, geopolitics and rivalries and competition, all those things. Now, from how are they, I mean, what are the resources? You are Chilean, you spent so many years in the region. What is it that you can say gives them the resilience to survive and to eke out a living and to somehow look forward? I mean, there is a spirit of Latin America, right? Like, what is it that, and can we also revive that, you know, because right now people are down, people are feeling very depressed, and the death rates and the infection rates are going up. So what is it that the ordinary people, the voluntary organizations, the civil society, what can they do in this moment of grave peril, and how can they complement what the governments or in a way substitute what the governments in some cases have failed to do? So
Oh,
let's talk about the community and
oh.
including the Central America, the Mexico, and South America. What is it that they can, the people of this region collectively can do to hold together and to survive this storm?
The key point here to keep in mind is the following. One advantage that Latin America has is that it's a bit like India. The demographics are that we are a very young region. That, of course, gives us an energy that other countries do not necessarily have. And that, it seems to me, is a big hope. The other big hope that I have seen is that in this rather dire picture that we are looking at, there are glimmers of hope. And one of the glimmers that I've seen in Chile and also elsewhere is that we have often when national governments have been unable to respond to the situation, have been unable to come up with responses that we need. It is at the local level. It is often young mayors. In Chile, there is a young mayor, Claudio Castro, from a municipality in the Santiago metropolitan region, Renca, that has come up with software for tracking people with infection and has come up with all sorts of responses that the national government has not been able to come up with. In Colombia, Daniel Riquelme, the mayor of Medellin, Medellin has a bit of a dark past for reasons that we all know, but it has really come back with great force. And this mayor, Mr. Riquelme, has done an excellent job in bringing people together and avoiding the worst of the pandemic and bringing his city forward. So I see that at the local level, people are coming up from the bottom up, as it were, with solutions. The big failures have often been seen at the national level. We talked earlier about Brazil, also Mexico and elsewhere. But where I see hope is that at the communities, at the local level, Tip O'Neill, the former speaker of the US House of Representatives, had this famous phrase, all politics is local politics. And in many ways, he was right. At the end, things happen, on the street, in the municipality. So that, it seems to me, is something that allows me to think that we will see, in the famous phrase, the light at the end of the tunnel and be able to move forward.
There will be light at the end of the tunnel. We hope so. Jorge, could you also reflect on Argentina? I mean, that's the other big country after Brazil and Mexico and Colombia in numbers. And, recently they're almost on the verge of another default. And this brings us to the question of the larger question of the debt. In the region, the economists are saying that none of the countries really have what they call the fiscal firepower to even generate the stimulus packages that we are seeing in other parts of the world. India, for example, Prime Minister Modi announced 10% of the GDP as a fiscal stimulus, to try and beat back the effects of the pandemic. But none of the countries in the region really have, it seems, the reserves or the surpluses, and they've already been incurring huge debt. And Argentina is probably the worst example of them because it has defaulted so many times and seems to mismanage its public finances. So that is also, I think that's like a compounding effect of the past. And now it's like going to snowball, and that may lower the living standards of people. And what is the
trap? That's a very important question. Argentina is a great country formed by extremely talented people that has given us, great writers, great Nobel Prize winners in all sorts of spheres, great sports people. And obviously it is going through a difficult moment now. Now, I will say this. Most observers would agree to the proposition that the government of President Fernandez has handled the pandemic quite well. They closed up early, they established a firm lockdown, and the result has been that you look at the numbers in Argentina, and they look pretty good. So in terms of managing the pandemic, the government of President Alberto Fernandez, should get credit for it. Now, a separate issue is the question of the debt and the possible default. And that, of course, is a real problem. This is something that has been going on for a long time. Most people thought that this issue would be solved during the government of President Mauricio Macri. It wasn't. There was a bit of kicking the can down the road there. And so Argentina is now facing that problem. It seems to me that it is important for the creditors to reach some sort of agreement. I mean, in the end, what is important to keep in mind is that Argentina is so rich in natural resources. It has the best land in the world, the so-called Pampa Húmeda, and it also has enormous mineral resources. We share a border with Argentina, the Andes Mountains. The Andes Mountains are essentially an open pit mine. Now, Chile is a mining country. We have developed our mining resources, quite a bit. Argentina hasn't, because they have such good land that they have decided to, basically to ignore their enormous mineral riches. But the Andes Mountain is the same, on both sides of the border. So my own sense is that no matter what happens in Argentina, the land is so rich, investors will always come back. People always say, well, there's a default in Argentina. This is the end. The country will never be able to overcome it. Well, it always does. So it's important to put things in perspective.
Yeah, so we will hope that Argentina, in fact, in the absence of Brazil right now, due to the ideological polarization and the division inside Brazil, one would hope that Argentina and others rise to the occasion and take the lead. We have a question, Jorge, from the audience.
Sure.
I'd like you to please respond to this from Ashish Baya. He says, taking into consideration the economic deficits of the larger countries, including Brazil, and the failure of the specialized agencies of the UN, like the WHO, and there is the Pan American Health Organization, which is the arm of the WHO, and the allegation that they're being manipulated by China. What is the best thing that could be done to restore temporary stability in the region? I mean, there is the potential of, as we discussed before, of unrest and even of the old ghost of military takeovers and such things are being. Some people are reviving that talk. So, how can, in the absence of capable governments and of broader international support system, I mean, IMF bailouts probably are not going to really work much to help any of these countries. So how can we have stability? Are we looking at a lot of violence and anarchy now?
Oh, well, let us not overdo this. I mean, things are bad, but this doesn't mean that they will all go down the wayside. There are two things here. But I would like to underscore something that I said earlier. The current crisis has highlighted the need for greater regional coordination. We don't have that. And unless we hang together, we will hang separately. So it is important to strengthen entities like CELAC, for example, which is the regional and umbrella entity that brings together all countries, South America, Central America, the Caribbean, and Mexico, which is right now being led by Mexico. So that is a very concrete thing that we can do. And here there's an issue. Believe it or not, CELAC doesn't even have a secretariat. There is the leadership varies from year to year. There's a pro tempore chairmanship. So some obscure foreign ministry official in the country that is chairing the entity is the person that, for all intents and purposes, runs CELAC, which is not a way to run a business. We need to allocate resources. The notion that a region of 650 million people cannot pay for a regional organization with a proper secretariat and staff and people that are able to do studies and report what is going on, it seems to me is a total madness. So that is one thing that is important to keep in mind. And an entity like that would also be able to work for and worry about attempts against against democracy and the stability of institutions. I'm afraid the OAS, I have a book on the role of the OAS in democratization in Latin America. right now, their record is not very good. There's a dark cloud about what the OAS did in Bolivia, in the elections in Bolivia, and so there's a real problem of credibility within the OAS in that sense. And so we need other entities that are able to come up and defend and strengthen our democratic institutions.
Great. Now I have one more question from Michael Kalavritinos in the audience. And the question is, there is discussion about Mexico benefiting from the shifting supply chains away from China. So, and even here in this region, Jorge, people are talking, Vietnam has benefited a lot from the diversion of investment away from China lately. There is, and because of the the bad feelings relating to the origins of the coronavirus and the dependence for essential medical products on China, there are many countries talking about disinvestment from China and relocating and looking for other places to manufacture. So global investors. So the question is, could Mexico, which already has a strong automobiles manufacturing capacity, or some other countries in the region, in South America or Central America, could you spot some potential beneficiaries or winners, if at all, from this current catastrophe going forward? Maybe some of them could attract more. You said earlier that they didn't have enough manufacturing. So is there a glimmer of hope in terms of a shift in terms of this global supply chain, or this regionalization of globalization, as they're calling your regional supply chains? Could we have that, and could you foresee some? I mean, Chile has been very successful itself as a commercial and a trading country over the years. So who do you think could emerge? I mean, that's the question really, Mexico or anyone else?
Sure. No, that's an excellent question. No, and you're absolutely right. What is happening is that people are looking at shortening these global supply chains, particularly in areas like pharma and medical supplies, where, basically right now they are far too long. And it seems to me, Mexico, because of its location so near to the United States, is in a very good position to do that. I think we shall see a major overhaul of existing supply chains. And if I were a betting man, I would say that one place that would benefit from that in Latin America is Mexico. Many of our countries don't have much manufacturing capacity. Now, one country that does have manufacturing capacity is Mexico. You mentioned the automobile industry and the others. So if Mexico plays its cards right, I think it might benefit quite a bit from it. Now, on the other hand, it seems to me I wouldn't, stress too much the difficulties this will pose for China. I mean, we're looking at people say in the next few years about half of the global product will come out of Asia. And the hardcore of that is China. So it is undergoing some current difficulties, but I wouldn't overplay it.
Right. Now, a question from Hari Seshasai, one of the well-known Latin America scholars.
A wonderful colleague and co-author of mine of many articles and books.
Yes, so Hari is in the audience and he's asking us a question. He's saying, thank you, Ambassador Heine. Do you think there is scope for India and Latin America to collaborate in some way to combat COVID-19, given the similarities of poverty levels and informal economies? And he's saying, is there, what are the lessons we can learn from each other, India and Latin America? And could this become the basis for another level of cooperation? Because right now, largely the relationship is based on trade and commerce and investment. But could we do something together? In fact, India and Africa have often been involved very closely in terms of public health, telemedicine, and such things. So is there something you foresee? I mean, you have been ambassador to India, you know the country very well. Could we do something together as a result of the problems arising from this pandemic?
Yeah. I think that's a great question, Hari. Thank you for it. Look, let me tell you the following. I think there's enormous room for it. I mentioned earlier the fact that Brazil, when it was facing the AIDS pandemic, it collaborated with India in coming up with generic medicines to deal with AIDS. India, of course, is a pharma and medical devices powerhouse. So I think there's enormous room for Latin America to work together with India on that. And if I may, I would also like to underscore that, India has not taken all the initiatives that it could with Latin America in the course of the past few years. We have written with Harry about this, and there's enormous room for improvement in terms of India's presence in Latin America. We would like to see a lot more of that. I think it would be a win-win situation. And collaboration in public health could be, a very important area. Here in the United States, I've been impressed by the number of Indian doctors who play a leading role in the public health area at Harvard University and elsewhere. So I think there is enormous room for collaboration. It could be a sort of way of starting a collaboration that until now has been basically been underplayed.
Great. Now we are almost out of time, Jorge, but I'll take up one last question with a quick response from you, please. There is a question from Ashish, who's asking what steps are going to be taken by the governments to curb human rights violations, especially in light of the problem in Venezuela and the continuing repression there. And in fact, maybe we should close with that because, Venezuela is a country with tremendous promise and it's gone down the drain, and we are all very shocked and sad at and this predates Corona, and one doubts how much the coronavirus has even spread in a country like Venezuela, where there's increasingly an authoritarian system. It is the problem child really for the region, right? And you have refugees across the borders, and many of whom are at risk of Corona. Now, this has been hanging for a while, for many years. The crisis has been building up, and could the current crisis, in the sense the pandemic, because it has wiped out everything, could there be a room for something, a fresh start, some initiative that can bring about a reconciliation and a transition in Venezuela and help them get across? Because I think if you can fix Venezuela in terms of the failure, then probably you will have a positive virtuous cycle that will emanate throughout the region. It seems to be holding back and dragging down the region and dividing it for a long time.
Absolutely. Now, Venezuela, of course, is very much of a sore point in a sore issue in Latin America right now. They have been going through a very difficult period, and it's been festering for a long time. That said, from the numbers we get and from what I hear from my Venezuelan friends, at least in terms of the pandemic, the situation doesn't seem to be too bad. There are many other issues, but at least in the pandemic, Venezuela has not become a hotspot. So that's the first point. The second point, it seems to me, what is important to keep in mind, for a while, for the past couple of years, a certain approach has been followed to try to deal with Venezuela, which has essentially been the talk about regime change. That, of course, hasn't gotten anywhere, as it often happened with that approach. What is needed is a different approach. What is needed is a diplomatic approach, which means you talk to the government, you talk to the governments of the countries that support the government of Venezuela right now, you talk to the neighbors, you talk to other Latin American countries, and you sit around the table and you come up with a solution. To start with regime change as the basic premise of whatever you are going to do is not the way forward. This is not the way things happen in today's world. So that is my own view of it.
Yeah, external interventions, Latin America is no stranger to it. Cold War, or even before, even the 19th century, since the formal independence from Europe, they have struggled with extra-regional powers interfering and meddling and stabilizing. And we certainly don't want the current, the so-called Greater Depression that's coming to become a fertile ground for artificially making more states fail in the region. So we would very much hope that the region comes together, can create an endogenous solution to Venezuela, and an endogenous solution along with the rest of the global South for the recovery, for a sustainable recovery from this deep crisis. I want to thank Ambassador Jorge Heine for his time. It's been really engaging. And I want to thank the audience. I think we covered a long ground. And the most important thing is, I think the new world order, so new Cold War may be an element of the new world order, but it's not going to be the only one. The South-South cooperation, Latin America, India, Africa, we are, I think, going to be more important than before. And it's a matter of tiding over this crisis and rebuilding on different principles. And I think, Jorge, you will share with me a sense of optimism. At the end of the day, that's the only way the human spirit can endure in these tragic times. So thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. And we'll see you again.
Thank you, Sreeram. We'll be in touch. Thank you for the opportunity. Bye-bye.